Recording in progress.
Good morning, participants. We are now starting the 5th session of our course on our media training, promoting a positive image of migrants and recognizing their contribution to development in the SADC region. And today, we're going to have a session that is a little bit similar to the one we had on Monday. We're going to have an open discussion on media campaign messages on addressing irregular migration, trafficking in persons, and smuggling of migrants related to policy, legislation, or migration practice and data. So for today, we're going to have Makungu's facilitation, and we have also guests who are going to present us some important information on this topic. And we're going also to have Vincent and Charles, who are going to be here with us, also making comments and helping with our discussion. So before we start, I have two reminders. So the first one is about eCampus. So if any participant here haven't yet logged in eCampus, it's important that you know that eCampus is the main platform for the course, and we have many activities that have to be completed on eCampus. So it's mandatory to log in to eCampus and to complete those activities to be able to get the certificate by the end of the course. So if you haven't yet done that, it's very important that you do it. If you are having any problem, if you have any trouble with logging in, please send us an email and we're going to assist you with that, okay? And the second point is about next week. So we're going to finish our webinars tomorrow. We have our last one tomorrow. And starting from next week, during 2 weeks, you are going to have an assignment that's also part of the course. That's the last phase of the course. And in this phase, you are going to prepare to produce stories or new pieces based on your ideas. And you are going to have coaches that are going to assist you with that also, that are going to mentor you during those two weeks. So I just want to let you know that this is what comes after starting next week, okay? So I think with that, we can start our session, and I give the floor to Makungu, who is going to present our speaker of today, and after she's going to facilitate the discussion as she did last Monday. Makungu, you have the floor. Thank you very much for your help.
Thank you, Fernando, and good morning to all our participants, and good morning to our experts and speakers for today. Today, as mentioned by Fernando, we are having a focus on issues of trafficking and smuggling of migrants, discussing some legislation, key messages that we need to drive in the media around the topic of trafficking of persons and smuggling of migrants. And with us today, we have Ms. Jeptum Bagoria, who is from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and a partner in the SAMM project, who will be giving a presentation on trafficking and smuggling of migrants. To not waste any time, I'll just hand over to Ms. Jeptum to take the floor on her presentation. Over to you, Jeptum.
Thank you very much, Makungu, colleagues here from the United Nations, facilitators or consultants, interpreters, and most importantly, members of the media here present. Good morning, and thank you so very much for making time to be with us this morning. I will be giving the presentation on trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants, the topic, as part of my role as in this overall SAMM project. It's a very interesting topic. At the same time, it's a very, very controversial topic. So I hope that we'll have a very engaging time with you this morning. How I'd like to break down the presentation will be twofold. One will just be a discussion, a sort of a presentation on what trafficking in person is, what smuggling of migrants is, and then the second part, which I hope will have more interaction, would be to get the role of the media, what we intend. We hope that you journalists and members of the media in the fourth estate will be able to assist us and partner with us moving forward in combating and addressing trafficking persons and smuggling of migrants. I hope that will be okay. I'll just move on to the slideshow. I will share my screen.
Olivier, tu mets tes chaussures, tu prépares ta raquette aussi. Vous partez dans 10 minutes.
All right, I'll introduce myself first so that you know who's speaking. As Makungu said, my name is Cheptum Bargoria. I manage the regional program on trafficking, person and smuggling of migrants in South Africa for UNODC. But at the same time, I also work under the SAMM project, again, implementing the component on these two areas. I must say, as you may have heard over the last week and so, migration is very interlinked. So a lot of the work that we do, it's very good that this SAMM project is wholesome, because a lot of the work that we do and a lot of the work that you'll see today on trafficking, person, smuggling of migrants does not only relate to one agency, relates to all the 4 agencies here. Because as you'll see later, a victim of trafficking may most often is exploited for labor purposes, and that is the very good work that ILO does. A lot of the victims of trafficking and smuggled migrants who are vulnerable usually require assistance in terms of protection and repatriation, etc. And IOM does a very excellent job in that role. Some of these also emanate from refugee camps, etc. UNHCR also has an intellectual role. So it's very good that we had the session last week with you as the media so that you can see the wholesome nature and how these different areas interlink. But UNODC has the mandate to oversee and support member states in combating trafficking in person and smuggling of migrants as part of the PIMO protocol. As you may be aware, different agencies have different mandates that they're tasked to support member states in implementing. So I think I'll just start by opening up the session to you, members of the media, to ask, what do you think a victim of trafficking is? And who do you think is a smuggled migrant? I will ask you to either raise your hands and we could get 1 or 2 comments from you, or you can put it on the chat and we can discuss. So either of these 3 questions that you feel comfortable in answering. I will pause for a minute for comments from the floor. Makungu, I hope you're able to see I'm not able to see who's raising their hands.
Yes, I'm able to see who's raising the hand, and I will be checking. So as Cheptum says, feel free to just either raise your hand or drop in the chat any of the answers to the following questions. What do you think trafficking in persons is? Who is a smuggled migrant? Or what do you think the challenges of smuggling of migrants in your countries are? We'll just wait 1 more minute. So just feel free to either raise your hand to come in or just drop the answer in the chat box.
Usually in classroom trainings, I usually have a bag of chocolates to motivate people, but now it's very difficult.
We'll give them virtual boxes of chocolates.
There you go.
So please drop your answer in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, we have an answer. Tobuluko Nzonyane says, smuggled migrant, I believe, is one who has entered the country through unregulated ports of entry.
And that is true. I'm so sorry, Toboloko. That is quite true to most extent, but it does have some other aspects that distinguishes this from irregular migration, etc. But you're quite right.
Okay, Anyone else? One. Anyone else? Charles has already dropped a bar of chocolates in the chat. So for you to able to have it, you need to drop your answer or raise your hand. Teminkosi, if you want to have a go.
No, I'm good. Sorry, I just joined in and I'm trying to stay away from the noise from my colleagues. Sorry for the interruption.
All right, thank you. Another answer from Ashok, it says trafficking of persons is about all illegal activities linked with movement of persons with or without their consent with the aim of making money.
Ashok, you're really on the right path. You have two elements of trafficking in persons that you've ticked there. So making of money without their consent and illegal activities, transnational organized nature of this crime. So well done. Yes, and indeed they're used for other purposes, including other transnational organized crime issues, including terrorism. So that's good. Well done, Ashok. So that's good, partners and colleagues. I'll just move on to the next slide. I see that we are all on advanced levels, so we will not have to go to the 0 grade of trafficking in person and smuggling of migrants. Okay, so I'll just give a definition of trafficking in persons. And this is a very technical definition, but I think it's important to give it as it is. And I must say why I insist that it should be given as it is. Member states took very many meetings and years to try and get this definition encompassed because it's very broad and includes very many elements of trafficking in person that need to be identified to ensure that it's trafficking in persons and not other criminal elements or other criminal migration acts. So I will read it as it is. Excuse the technicality of it, but it's very important. So trafficking in persons shall mean the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harbor or receipts of persons by means of threat or use of force or other forms of coercion or abduction or fraud or deception or the abuse of power or a position of vulnerability or of giving and receiving of payments for benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for purposes of exploitation. The exploitation element in this whole long definition is very important because that element has to be proven for it to qualify as trafficking in person. That I must have either cheated you or coerced you or abducted you for me to use you for, for exploitative purposes, for financial gain. So this is just a tabulation that breaks down what I've just read, which was very wholesome, so that it shows the 3 elements that really need to be qualified and adduced before you can, have a conclusion that this is trafficking that is going on. This is a victim of trafficking, or this is a trafficking in person syndicate. More often than not, the people who do the perpetrators of this crime are mostly not only involved in trafficking in persons, more often they're part of a larger syndicate, a larger organized group, and they may involve themselves in other things like other illicit crimes like money laundering or illicit transfer of wildlife crime or wildlife products, etc. So it's important to know that this sometimes fall in a greater subset. Trafficking in person is also often confused with smuggling of migrants, which our participants mentioned was an illegal entry into a country, which is correct. So smuggling of migrants is an illegal entry of a person, is the facilitation of an illegal entry of a person into a country in which that person is not a national or a permanent resident for financial gain. So again, this one is very important because the purpose of for financial and material gain is important for us to be able to prove that this person was used for that purpose. Again, usually the people who facilitate smuggling of migrants into countries usually are part of the networks or criminal networks that also facilitate trafficking. That's why there's a lot of interlocution of who does what and what is what. So here I just put a summary of what is the difference between trafficking in person and smuggling of migrants. Very important, trafficking in person can occur within a country. You can be trafficked from one part of one town to another town. And I'll give an example which happens a lot in this continent. You have, you know, someone in the village who the family is struggling. The daughter or the son is taken and told you'll go into the city to work for family, to be a domestic servant or etc. And most often, if they're, of course, they're underage, they're taken into the city without their consent. They work, they do not get remunerated. The money is either given to the person who facilitates them into that house, or it's taken somewhere else. So that is labor exploitation. And that is a very big issue that a lot of people engage in, sometimes out of ignorance, sometimes out of cheap labor opportunities, etc. But again, this is one example that I would give to show you that trafficking occurs within a country. For smuggling, it has to have the transnational border element. You must cross a border, right? You must enter another country without the authority, without having the correct papers. The purposes, again, as I mentioned, for trafficking is for exploitation. For smuggling is for material benefit. And the means for trafficking is usually no consent. They never know. Most of the times they're lied to. They're told, okay, for instance, you're going to get a job somewhere else. It's going to be very lucrative, but at the end, you end up being trafficked for, I'll give a very controversial element, organ removal, right? Or trafficked for forced labor somewhere. Smuggling is usually very, very different. It's voluntary. The person usually wants to go to another country, mainly for better economic purposes, and they know that they're going, but at the same time, the purpose of them going and the network usually may end up to be a criminal activity involved. So I'll just give a few trends of trafficking in persons over the last couple of years. Usually, from what we've seen from the data that we as UNODC have, and I believe our colleagues from IOM also here have significant data on this, female victims continue to be the primary targets. Although, depending on where you go, for instance, in the mining area in Southern Africa, you'll see a lot of male victims. The victims' profile differ, as I've mentioned, based on where they're found. In 2018, most women were trafficked for sexual exploitation, mainly in towns. And the men and the boys, as I mentioned, were trafficked for forced labor in factories, agricultural farms, mines, etc. Offenders, as I mentioned previously, are usually members of organized criminal groups, organized criminal syndicates, which and they operate usually with different, I would say, sleeper cells or pockets of the organizations within the grassroots and within our communities who assist in the recruiting of these victims. And over the last 2 years or so, we've seen a significant increase in the integration of technology in their business model, obviously, because we all know that now technology is playing a very key role in terms of our daily lives. Social media, Facebook in the region is very key in targeting, for instance, students in school, Instagram, etc. So this is very important for us to note as members of the media. Push factors that usually push and motivate victims or push victims towards falling into the hands of these criminals: lack of employment, lack of finances, lack of systems and institutions to support and protect them. This falls into the purview of legislators and the executive and the government. Discrimination or exclusion from one's community or society for whatever cultural practice or other. Gender discrimination, political instability. We've seen in some countries up in North and Central Africa where there's significant political instability. There's a lot of people trying to get out of the country, or victims who may not be well equipped to identify or to prevent themselves from falling into the hands of these attackers. In terms of pull factors, and this really relates a lot to smuggling of migrants, there is, for instance, relentless demand for cheap labor. You know, you go work somewhere and they're told there's someone who you can pay a quarter of what you're paying currently, and you accept that person, not knowing that you're part of facilitating an illegal activity that is really a serious crime, you know. Demand for, this is again very controversial, but it's very important for us to mention it, demand for infants or babies for adoption. You know that there's a lot of baby theft or child theft that is occurring in our continent, for children being stolen to be given to other families for adoption, etc. There's also the growing global demand for organs, organ harvesting. There's also illicit recruitment of people for exploitative practices, harmful cultural practices. These are all factors that facilitate trafficking, presence, and smuggling of migrants. So I'll just give an overview of who does what, so that it's to give you a knowledge on who is responsible for what in terms of addressing these two items. Of course, government is responsible for overall security and protection of its people. They are responsible to prevent, legislate, and implement policies, laws, and procedures that will help protect the victims and prosecute violators. We as international organizations here present, IOM, ILO, UNODC, and UNHCR, are responsible to support member states in implementing their international obligations, because they signed and ratified the PAIMO protocol, which is the overall governing body against trafficking, person, and smuggling of migrants. We also support in research, capacity building, awareness raising, even practical assistance, like really holding the hands of the victim and taking them back to their communities. We as international organizations do that to support the victims. Human rights advocate, of course, advocates help in advocating against this crime and raising the volume and raising awareness. The private sector can be very useful in terms of creating formal employment and formal opportunity, and also being a lobbying group for governments to be able to have channels for members of countries or a significant pocket of people who may not be privileged to join, to have the labor opportunities that others have in the countries. Academic and research institutions, of course, for conducting research and providing information and data for policy creation for the four aforementioned. Most importantly, the media. Why are you important? You're very important because you support, first and foremost, in awareness raising. The stories that you do, the news action, the news items that you bring up, really create awareness for the victims and for the members of the public, for society. We all know society looks up to you as members of the media. So whatever you say in terms of trafficking, person, and smuggling of migrants goes a long way in raising awareness. Once you raise awareness, then the information that people have received will empower them, and this helps them prevent increase of trafficking persons, prevent them from falling into the harmful arms of the trafficking syndicates or smuggling, or for them to be victims of migrant smuggling. You know, the knowledge that you create, members of the media, you're very, very instrumental, because, for instance, you have undercover stories. You're able to go in depth and get even information that we as civil society may not have, information that even member states may have but may not be willing to share. But you, as the members of the fourth estate, you're able to you have that power to be able to get in-depth knowledge, to be able to uncover networks, etc. More importantly, you help encourage hope, spread hope, because even the stories that you share of victims, of people who've been rescued, really inspires hope. Even for people, for instance, you're a victim of trafficking who's trapped in a house and all you have is your radio, your TV, etc. You're able to listen to stories if by chance you find a story of someone who's been rescued or someone's life who's been changed in terms of trafficking or smuggled migrant who was in a vulnerable situation. Then you inspire hope. And this really is very, very important. I will now move to, after I've given this overview of what trafficking, person, and smuggling of migrants is, what can we do as practical solutions and actions in terms of addressing this challenge? I've put a few key messages that can, I'll just leave it here and it will be in the presentation, that you can use in terms of formulating stories, in terms of pushing hashtags or social media activities that really aim and touch the heart of the challenge and would be very instrumental. So I'll just leave that there, we'll come back to it later. A very key aspect of you members of the media and getting information on trafficking persons and smuggling migrants is through face-to-face interviews. And interviews are really encouraged to be undertaken with a caveat, of course, that this is the topic of this topic is very sensitive, and as much as possible, you have to, as you conduct your interview, you must try and protect the victim. The victim is very, very important because the victim has suffered a lot of trauma to be able to come out and speak. So you must be able to conduct an interview, but at the same time, the caveat that you protect the victim, also protect the witnesses as much as possible, because the witnesses are necessary to be able to have a successful prosecution and put the perpetrators behind bars. So interviews are very important, and journalists are encouraged to conduct interviews whenever possible. It is important to be able, because I've explained the different actors and the people involved, it's important to be able to try as much as possible to get a wholesome story, to get a story that gets account of the various actors, either if it is government, either it's the victim, either it's a witness, if it's a community, to be able to get all the pieces together so that you have a really wholesome story. It's also important to be able to get accurate and complete data, and the data should be verified by you, because as I mentioned previously, the public really looks out to you and takes what you as the media say as absolute truth. So you must be able to report with that authority and with that truth, with data that has been verified. And in the event that you're not able to get the story firsthand from, the social worker or the victim, etc., then when you deal with secondary sources, it's important to try as much as possible to try and verify that information. You can verify it with us, the United Nations organizations here present, verify it with the government, verify law enforcement, wherever you, depending on the story and the angle, wherever you see, can verify your story and give it the weight. And as I'd mentioned previously, it is very, very important to be able to be respectful and handle the victims particularly very, very carefully, because they're to be able to avoid secondary trauma and to be able to assist in the healing and facilitate that process. Another tip that I'd like to give in terms of reporting on TIP and SOM is that you should be able to know, as I previously mentioned, what trafficking person is and smuggling of migrants is, not to confuse the two and report a smuggling of migrants issue as a trafficking person issue. And in the beginning, I'd mentioned that trafficking person and smuggling of migrants, particularly in this region, is a very, very sensitive issue because of the migration challenges and complexities that they are. So it's very important to be able to not write the sensationalization of the story, not ride that wave, and be able to be, to be very impartial and to be very focused in terms of reporting trafficking and smuggling of migrants. Again, very important, there's a lot of stereotypes, not only in this region, globally. You'd say that X and X person is from this part, or this is the same stereotype. And you as the media are encouraged to not perpetuate any stereotypes, so that this will help create a proper sort of platform and field to discussing trafficking persons and smuggling of migrants, to be able to encourage people who are victims or may know of the syndicates to speak up, because it's very difficult to speak up when you know that you might be victimized, or there are stereotypes and people may not listen to you or may not take it seriously. It's also very important for you as a media to be able to change the story to be a story that inspires, to expand the conversation around human trafficking and smuggling of migrants. Positive coverage is something that I will stress today in terms of this topic, because it's a topic that is very, very sad, very heavy, and also very difficult. It's important to be able to show a story, to show the weight and depth of the story and the challenge, but at the same time, give it a twist so that it inspires action from the government. It inspires action from the community. It inspires the victims to be able to speak out so that the syndicates can be brought down and arrested and prosecuted. Again, of course, this goes without saying. We know that you media do this very well. It's important to also protect your sources, witness protection. so that we don't expose the communities, the victims, and the witnesses, and then that puts them in danger when, for instance, the criminal syndicates come back. So it's very, very important to be able to protect, give information that promotes the discussion, but at the same time protects the victims. Right, this is something that I'd also like to highlight to you. As I've mentioned previously, this is a very sensitive topic, trafficking in persons, and a lot of the victims of trafficking in persons are usually minors. A lot of the cases that we have come across in Southern Africa, particularly the cases that we were reviewing on the courts over the last 3 years, most of them, I would say 70%, involve minors. It's very unfortunate, but that is the reality. When you're dealing with a child, of course, you as journalists and members of the media already have your code of conduct and your protocols when it comes to interviewing and protecting minors. But I think it's important for us to have this slide here so that we can buttress this very important issue in terms of reporting. Very important to not stigmatize the child. In fact, when you have to conduct an interview, it's preferred that when it's a minor, the interview is not undertaken directly with the child, but perhaps the social worker or the law enforcement officer, because children, their memories are quite strong, and it's very important to prevent any further trauma and stigmatization against the child. It's very important to avoid descriptions that exposes the child to negative reporting and negative reprisals, including additional physical or psychological harm or abuse. It's always important to provide an accurate context for the child's story, and also for the image. But I know you have this where, if you really must take an image of the child, you don't take the front picture, you don't show their face, you don't try as much as possible to conceal the identity of the child. It's very important to always give a pseudonym for the child so that you're not able to identify who the child is. Even identify the community. It's very important you don't identify the community, because it's easy to go back and trace from the community who the child or the victim was. Again, it's important to not name that, to give information on the child's detail. For instance, if the child has been significantly sexually abused, or is a child living with HIV or AIDS or any other disease, their health status. If a child has been convicted of a crime, it's important not to mention that. Try and protect the child as much as possible. Also, it also helps the story, because if you give this angle, then of course the story and the focus shifts from what we're reporting the crime to what the child is or who the community is, etc. I also added a slide on who the target audiences in terms of trafficking in person and smuggling of migrants are. The opponents who are against us, who are against you, the media. Of course, it's the criminal networks and involved leaders, business leaders who are involved in these criminal gangs. In terms of who are neutral and who really would support this initiative, would be the family, the communities, the church, traditional leaders, celebrities, sports figures, etc. Your allies, I would say, of course, it goes without saying, us as the United Nations are your allies or your friends. We help you and would work together with you in combating trafficking, person, and smuggling of migrants. Development partners, we have development partners like the European Union, who has generously contributed to this initiative, are a strong allies because they support us technically, politically, policy-wise, and also financially to be able to address these crimes. The communities themselves are a very good ally to have because they're able to share the information of the networks. These networks operate from within the communities. So the community is able to point out and say, hey, look, this person has been giving information and has been recruiting or sending children to a different town. Why don't we try and arrest them or follow the money to see how we can stop this issue? All right, I'll just end here. I think this is my final slide, and say that we look up to you for the media to walk with us this journey, for us to find a balanced story, to get proper facts and to be able to protect our victims and really shed and spread the word in terms of what trafficking, person, and smuggling of migrants are, the dangers that exist therein. And also to mention that in the stories that we report in as the media, we'd urge you to be victim-centered so that we're able to protect the victims and be able to hold these criminals to accountability. There are a few questions here that I would like us to engage in, but I'll leave it to Makungu and our moderators to be able to pose these questions, and we could have an interactive session on, you know, good stories, good headlines, forms of trafficking, etc., and we can engage in that front. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Over
very
to you.
much. Thank you very much, Jeptum, for that informative presentation. We will ask the same questions. Oh, there's a hand from Abibo. Before we go to the questions, I'll just let Abibo come in. Abibo is, as you know, from Monday, he is our partner from the International Organization on Migration, IOM, and they also do a lot of work in the project around regular migration as well. And as Jeptum mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, that smuggling of migrants and trafficking in persons is not an isolated issue. It works in conjunction with other issues that the other agencies are experts in. So I'll just let Abibo come in, and while Abibo is speaking, I would like you to start thinking of some of the questions you would like to ask Jeptum from her presentation. We've been talking about migration in general, and with a very strong focus on migrant workers, people who move for the purposes of work, but now we've shifted the focus a bit to trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants. What are some of the things that are interesting to you, or some of the challenges you've encountered when trying to report on issues of trafficking in persons that you think having some discussions or asking those questions to Jeptum would be of great use to you going back to your field of work? Right now, I'll just let Abibo come in to give his inputs and comments. Over to you, Abibo.
Thank you very much, Makungu. Thank you very much, Jeptum. Good morning, everyone. Very much in the same stride as what Jeptum said on trafficking in persons and smuggling. It would also be important for our media practitioner colleagues to get a bit of a feel of a wide understanding of the concept of irregular migration as well, which, as you rightfully said, Makungu, is very much interlinked with the matters of smuggling and trafficking in persons. But just to provide a definition that is somewhat widely and globally agreed upon when it comes to irregular migration, the definition goes along these lines, that it's a movement of persons that takes place outside the laws, regulations, or international agreements governing the entry into or exit from the state of origin, transit, or destination. It's important to know that although a universally accepted definition of irregular migration does not exist, the term is generally used to identify persons moving, like I said, outside regular migration channels. The fact that they migrate irregularly does not relieve states from the obligation to protect their rights. And moreover, categories of migrants who may not have any other choice but to use irregular migration channels can also include refugees, victims of trafficking, as we mentioned, or unaccompanied migrant children. And the fact that they use irregular migration pathways does not imply that states are not, in some circumstances, obliged to provide them with some forms of protection under international law, including access to international protection for asylum seekers fleeing persecution, conflicts, or generalized violence. And in addition, refugees are protected actually under international law against being penalized for unauthorized entry or stay if they have traveled from a place where they were at risk to another country. So there are two groups actually of irregular migrants that are important to know. Number one, you have those who arrive secretively, and those who arrive and then overstay the period stated in their visa. So those are the two groups. The irregular migrants include undocumented migrants, also children, of course, victims of trafficking, smuggling, migrants in detention centers, deportees, and also stranded migrants. I mean, we've already discussed, Jeptum's very, very eloquently discussed the push and pull factors. We do not need to go over that again. But what is important to also understand here is that the purpose of changing the narrative about migrants, and of course, in this case, we're focusing on Southern Africa. So the purpose of changing the narrative about migrants in the region is to change the current polarizing narrative to a more fair and nuanced type of reporting, which we believe will benefit the region not only socially, but also economically. And in that sense, I think that most of you being media practitioners, being exposed to media outputs way more than any of us here, have noticed that the current narrative, beyond just being slightly polarizing, is usually victim orientated, often one-sided, and often with an absence of context and facts. And this is exactly why the discussions of today, and actually of the past 2 weeks, are trying as hard as possible to make us to provide context for everything, so that the reporting becomes more thorough. So we want to move from that, and the desired narrative would rather be inclusive of different voices. It would reflect definitely different narratives and nuances of lived experiences of migrants in this region. It would also be a bit more focused on reflecting urgency of migrants, and it would definitely have the encouragement towards all of you to seek out the truth, because as we know, journalism has a very investigative nature, which is essential to such an endeavor. And of course, it should the desired narrative should also be constructive. Without going further into details, I just wanted to introduce at least that, add to the discussion, that concept of irregular migration, which seems to be like more of a zoomed out view that includes many of the notions discussed today. But overall, as a final thought for my intervention here, we know that peacekeeping is not the journalist's responsibility, but rather good in-depth reporting can contribute significantly towards the creation of conditions that enable people to respect each other and to also resolve differences. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abibo, for those inputs and making the link between irregular migration, the relationship between irregular migration and trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants in the whole migration cycle, which is what we've been discussing in this training. And as I've mentioned that today we really would like to hear from you as members of the media, our participants throughout this course. What are some of the challenges, for example, when you have to report on issues of trafficking? Are the barriers of entry in terms of accessing information from a legal perspective, or do you have challenges actually just finding the right channels to go and source out the stories? So I would just encourage everyone to either raise your hand or drop in the chat box. We are going to also try and answer the questions that Jeptum has rightfully or kindly laid out for us in terms of what are some of the forms of trafficking that we see reported the most in the media landscape, and what are those that are underreported, and how can we try and bring that balance in terms of reporting around issues of trafficking. But as you think through these questions, and I give you a minute to type in the chat, drop your questions in the chat or raise your hand. Feel free to also raise your hand, and we'll give you the floor to ask the questions or give your input. I'll also now just go to our two participants, Charles and not participants, our experts, sorry, Charles and Vincent, who have been with us throughout the whole course, discussing issues of migration. And now to just hear some of their perspectives and their inputs, now that we've moved the focus from migrant workers to issues of trafficking, around what are some of the key ideas or key messages or key challenges that they've actually either encountered in their work around issues of trafficking in persons, or something that they can see that us together with the media we could change in terms of the narrative or coming up with the balanced story. If we can all just sum up the whole course in a few words, it will be all are trying to move towards having more balanced stories. We're not saying right, good or positive or negative coverage, but we want to just now create a more balanced narrative around the topic of migration. So now I'll hand over to Charles to just give some of his thoughts and ideas around this issues while our participants are dropping in your questions and comments in the chat box or raising your hands to come through. Over to you, Charles.
Thank you very much, Makungu. I don't know if I can share my screen. Maybe Jeptum, if for a second you can stop the presentation. I just wanted to share my screen and have you reflect. I hope you can see my screen. This is a message that was posted just yesterday on social media, on Twitter, by someone who is a special envoy for UNHCR in the Mediterranean Sea. And I think when we talk about trafficking, it's quite interesting to look at how this message is framed. And I think where one of the main challenges of being sensitive to trafficking is. We're seeing increasingly in many regions of the world, the idea that migration flows would be composed basically of two types of migrants. So for those who are unaware, 2 days ago, there's a boat that arrived in Lampedusa in Italy, in an island off of Italy, coming from the shores of Northern Africa, with about 686 persons on board. And here in this message, this person tells us, most of them are economic migrants who will not be eligible to reside in Europe. Countries of origin have to be faster in readmitting their nationals if we want to see progress on asylum management and legal migration pathways. What does this mean? Basically, it means that on this boat, we either have economic migrants who are people who are moving for economic purposes, or we have asylum seekers and possible refugees. And that would be basically the two possibilities. In Europe and in several countries, economic migrant has been quite synonymous to, let's say, irregular migrants who are not necessarily welcomed and which we cannot put necessarily in a box. But there's really this idea, and we hear it constantly in some European countries, that migration, especially from less developed countries, would be about either refugees or about irregular economic migrants. One thing, for example, is completely missing from this analysis would be the possibility that on this boat there would be victims of trafficking, for example, which they would not necessarily fall under the asylum management system. They are not necessarily refugees, but they are not necessarily here because they are trying to enter irregularly for economic purposes. They actually find themselves on this boat because they have been coerced, victim of a recruitment mechanism, deceptive recruitment, or they have been threatened. And they have been displaced so that others can exploit and benefit from them. And when we look at narratives around, I've taken here a tweet by someone who is representative of UNHCR, not to say that the organization is biased in its approach, but it's very frequent that we tend to overlook the possibility that a migrant be a victim of trafficking. And it's, I would say it's difficult because most refugee crises are quite, I would say, straightforward. You know, we've had recently a very strong crisis in Afghanistan. Enforcement officials who will see migrants coming in from Afghanistan will tend to think that these migrants might be possible asylum seekers and refugees. Trafficking is a much more subtle concept. Someone who is migrating or who is displaced within his or her country under trafficking in person does not walk around with a name tag saying, I am trafficked. And so it is really, really difficult, challenging for us as a community and for media practitioners to be sensitive. And if you are not constantly considering that option as a possibility, then it will be very difficult for you to report on these issues. That's number one. The second comment I wanted to make, I was listening to Jeptum and to Abibo, making reference to victims of trafficking. And it's true that in our usual language and terminology, people who have undergone trafficking in person are qualified as victims. They are a victim of a situation. But when we reach out to precisely these victims and we ask them in general how they would like to be called, notably in the media and in the news, they often prefer the term survivor. And that's something that's interesting and I'd like you to reflect about. Because very often cases of trafficking come to public knowledge through the news. And it's not the same thing for someone to be portrayed as a victim, which is often suggest the idea that the person was passive, does not necessarily have a lot of agency, victim of a situation, maybe. That's one way of portraying, but comes along, and I think Jeptum rightly pointed that as a risk when we report on these issues. There is a risk of re-victimization when we have someone that has undergone a process, and we as the news come a little bit afterwards and ask the person to retell that story. There is the risk of especially for minors, of re-victimization processes, which can be in terms of mental health quite harmful. And when we look at this discussion and we try to switch from victims to survivors, we're actually acknowledging that the people who have undergone these terrible events actually have an agency. Maybe they were forced, most probably they were forced or duped or deceived into this situation. But what's interesting, and that goes back to maybe the positive aspect of the stories that Jeptum was suggesting, or the constructive journalism that Carolina was talking about last week, when we're shifting from a victim to a survivor-centered narrative, we're actually saying that these persons have agency. And what they have overcome is most probably some of the most incredible succession of events to actually undergo trafficking and then be able to survive and possibly have new desires for the future. So I'd really like you to reflect on this story of victims and survivors. those were the initial comments. I look forward to the discussion, and I give the floor to Vincent, who might have some comments as well.
Thank you. Thank you
Yes.
so much, Charles. Over to you, Vincent.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you, Makungu. And also thank you to Jeptum and Abibo for what I thought were very comprehensive presentations and information. I have 4 different issues that I very briefly want to address. The first is in relation to Abibo's definitions of irregular migration, which I fully agree with. But I would venture to say that there's also a third element. So the first that Abibo mentioned, the 2 that Abibo mentioned, was people who enter a country without any documents. The second was people who enter with documents, but then they overstay the period that those documents allow for. But then the third element of irregular migration are people who enter with documents. They are still within the period that those documents allow for, but they are engaged in activities that the documents do not permit. So for example, someone who may enter for the purpose of a holiday and they have a 3-month visa, so they are documented, they're within that period, but then they take up employment, which is not allowed in terms of the documentation. So I think I just wanted to add that there's a third dimension of irregularity, which is quite frequently in SADC combined with the undocumented migration and the overstays. We often see people who engage in activities that they're not authorized to do. To go back to some of the things that Jeptum was talking about, and in terms of media reporting on issues of trafficking, in my experience, often when I read media reports on trafficking, there are 2 angles that are pursued. The one is that it's often pitched as a human interest story. So where the story of the survivor is being told, what happened to that person, how it happened to them, and so on. And so, of course, that often draws a lot of attention. And that's important, that we tell the stories of the survivors. So we help create awareness around the issue of trafficking and so on. The other angle is that it's often reported as a crime story. So the outcome of a court case or the process of prosecution that is underway. And of course, both of those are important. What I find is often missing from the media reporting is linking it to a broader understanding of what trafficking is about. So these stories, while they are important, they often are not, in my view, sufficiently explicit in explaining what trafficking is, particularly in terms of the definition that Jeptum provided earlier. So it's really, so we don't just read it as the story of the survivor or the outcome of a court case or the process of a prosecution, but we really understand what trafficking involves, what the elements of trafficking are, how the traffickers operate, and so on. And I think that context is important to help with awareness and hopefully help with prevention of trafficking as well. So I think it's important that we don't just ignore the broader context. And so it would be helpful to also explain, for example, the scale of trafficking globally or the scale of trafficking in a particular country to the extent that we have the information. And then the final point I want to make, I think Jeptum referred to it, I just want to emphasize the point, which is that often when I talk to people about trafficking, the response I get is, well, but they went with the traffickers willingly, they agreed to go with them. And so it's often reduced, or in people's minds, it's often reduced to a case of smuggling. And what they're missing is that even though a lot of trafficking is legal, people have the appropriate documentation, they voluntarily agreed to go with the traffickers, what is often ignored is the fact that they were deceived. So we often think of trafficking as people being abducted, or people being coerced in some form or the other. The element of deception, I think, needs to be emphasized a lot more. So the fact that someone agreed, the fact that they willingly accompanied a trafficker does not mean that it was not trafficking. And I think it's important to clear up that misconception. So when we tell the stories, We need to point out that, yes, this person, the survivor of trafficking may have agreed to go. They may have even paid to get documentation, and it may have all been legal in terms of immigration law and immigration procedure. But the fact that they were deceived because they were lied to about when they go to the country, what kind of job they were going to be involved in, the fact that there was ongoing exploitation. And I think it's helpful for journalists and other media practitioners to clarify that the victimhood, someone was abused, they were abducted, they were forced, is not necessarily the case. What's important is that very often survivors of trafficking are actually deceived and they are exploited in an ongoing way. And that to clarify that difference so that people who read the stories have a broader understanding of what trafficking involves as well.
Thank you so much to both Vincent and Charles for those great inputs in terms of highlighting some of the issues and some of the things that we're starting to thinking about when we're talking of trafficking in persons. I want to just quickly go back to what Charles, to the tweet that Charles shared for us. And I think it's something that ties into what Jeptum was mentioning, that we need to verify and to try and look deep into the stories that maybe, yes, it was, right now it's reported more of a issue of migration or migrant workers who coming to look for a job, but maybe it is also a case of trafficking in persons. So I think it's good that as members of the media, as journalists, as reporters, we start going into depth into what Vincent is also saying, that it's always either a survivor story or a crime story, but let's just tap into those nuances and, delve deeper, ask the hard questions, do the research, call the authorities and ask how else we can try and shape and balance and enhance the stories we report on in terms of trafficking in persons. I see in the chat there were two answers to the question that Jeptum had posed about a good headline, particularly one around trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants. Ashok says a good headline is one which reflects the gist of the story and captivates attention and interest. It could be on a negative and or a positive event, incident, situation, etc. It needs not to be sensational nor restrictive, but should convey the reality with a sense of responsibility. And I think that's a very good answer. I'm sure even our experts are pleased with the answer. But the question is then, how do we then make that a reality? Like, how do we then go out there in our field of work and adhere to this description of what a headline is? Often than not, we see very sensationalized headlines. What do we think are some of the challenges that make people write sensational headlines around these topics? Is it to sell? I mean, in journalism, there's always a phrase that what bleeds leads. How can then we as a member of the media change the narrative of not going always with what is sensational or what bleeds in that term to sell our papers or to sell our articles? So it's something that we also now to start thinking about as members of the media. Tobuluko says, I believe the good headline is one which highlights the plight of the victims while not deviating from the truth. I completely agree. I'll just open the floor to our experts, both Abibo, Jeptum, Charles, and Vincent, to give some of their comments or inputs in terms of those two answers, and then we'll move on to the question raised by Esinkala. Anyone can take the floor first regarding any inputs they have or comments on the two answers we've received.
Very quickly, I just wanted to single out a word in Ashok's comment, which for me is really a key word, which is, or two words, captivate attention. That's where the challenge is, I think. That's what pushed a lot of the news production to produce sensationalist stories. Sensational is what captivates attention by definition. And it tends to be maybe the easy way to captivate attention. It's true. I mean, when Jeptum tells us when you're reporting on, for example, children victim of trafficking in person, including elements of their story, which are typically sensational elements, maybe that they have been a victim of severe abuse, but when you look at it, which aren't necessarily elements of the story, but which the news or the general public might be interested in for really not the positive aspects of what we like, that is an easy way to captivate attention. Much more complex to captivate attention, excluding some of these more morbid aspects of human life and human reality. One thing that I find interesting and that is often overlooked, just to show you how to captivate attention, is also when we look at trafficking in person for labor exploitation. It's one of the reasons is also, this important demand for cheap labor, which is often connected to the demand for cheap consumer goods. I think one interesting narrative that's often missing is how can we make sure that our audience reflects on its own behavior and some way or another participates in fueling the need for trafficking in person or labor exploitation. I often think about the 2016 Associated Press story, Seafood from Slaves, which won the Pulitzer Prize in the United States, and which got a huge attention from the general public, and which was a story about human trafficking in the seafood production industry in South Asia. And you might wonder, why would American readers of newspapers be interested in human trafficking in Southeast Asia? Well, because the journalists were very clever at captivating attention and at telling the readers that this story very far away about fishing vessels in Southeast Asia were somewhat connected to their reality. And that, I think, is very important, creating those connections. What it requires is journalists and communicators to have a good understanding of the general issues around trafficking in person, not just the act of trafficking, but what trafficking actually is connected to. And that might be a way, Ashok, to find stories that captivate attention and interest without solely exposing victim or survivors' personal dramatic stories.
Thank you, Charles, for those very, very, very important inputs. Anyone else from our experts would like to add on to what Charles said or compliments? Yes, Jepton, you can go ahead.
Thank you. I think, I don't have much to add from what Charles has said, but also I realized that I didn't highlight two important opportunities for the media here today. For instance, in South Africa, the first week of October is usually World Trafficking in Person Week for South Africa, for the Republic. So there's different initiatives held in South Africa to commemorate victims of trafficking in persons and to just commemorate this week. One example in which can form a good story, there's an event that is being held in the Eastern Cape where there was a lady, her story, a lady was taken for sexual exploitation and was held for a couple of months, I think years, for sexual exploitation since she was 16. She managed to escape and she was reunited back with her community, and they have done community rehab, they've reintegrated her back into the society and done a lot of community awareness. So she was able to also develop a book about her story and her life, which is, so this is a story that I give as you as a media might want to look into, because that's an empowering story of a victim who is not a victim anymore, but a survivor, as was mentioned earlier, someone who's come out and is strong and is willing to support other survivors through their story. There's also community engagement, where the community is coming together to do different issues and events around trafficking in persons. So this is something that you might want to look at. We also have a World Trafficking Day, which is held every year, mid of the year, on the 30th of June. And you know, these are sort of opportunities for you as media to be able to highlight stories of trafficking in persons, smuggling of migrants, to be able to create awareness around what has been mentioned by Charles and by my colleagues here. I just thought I'd plug that in before I forget. Over back to you, Makungu.
Thank you so much, Jeptun, for those inputs. And I think it's very useful for the media to also know and ahead of time that they can start thinking about this week, the week of commemorating trafficking in the country, and starting about how to share the stories of survivors and the positive stories that we have. I want to now go to the question that was posed by Silas Ngala. I'll just read the question as is, and our experts can then come in and answer and try to give some answers or inputs to the question. The question says, the smuggling of persons between Zimbabwe and South Africa is so rampant such that as we speak here, it's happening somewhere. The major challenge in Zimbabwe is the delay by authorities in processing their passports, hence long queues and backlog at the passport offices, which discourages many from applying and opt for irregular border crossing. My question is, how best can the media intervene to encourage authorities to speed processing of documents and also encourage citizens to apply for documents and desist from irregular migration? Which other stakeholders can be used by the media to pressure authorities to prioritize issuing documents speedily to prevent illegal movements?
Young people.
Thank you. Doctors, may you kindly mute your mic, please? Thanks.
Just for different age groups, but young people are all interested.
Sorry, I just muted doctors, but that is the question, and I would like now for our experts, anyone can give it a go ahead, or you can all complement each other in trying to answer the question posed by Silas. Jeptun, you can go first.
Thank you very much, Silas. That's a very, very good question that you've raised. First, I'd like to mention that the issue of migration in Southern Africa is made more complex due to the SADC free movement protocol, right? In other countries where there's no free movement protocols, it's more linear, because you know that this person is not allowed to be here and they have no access to the country, etc. And it's very, very direct. When it comes to Southern Africa, because of the free movement protocol, it compounds the challenges of trying to really delineate or identify these issues of trafficking person and smuggling of migrants. But back to your question, the media plays different hats. And one hat that is very key to this question that you've posed is that as you know, of the hat of putting pressure on governments to be able to enact policy through your stories, right? And for instance, I'm looking at you as the media going to interview persons who have you know, lodged their passports with immigration and have not received their passports in 1 year and 2 years, or in the time that is stipulated by the law or the legislation. And then you go back to the Ministry of Immigration and question what the procedure is and what the problem may be, right? And I leave, you know, this open to other colleagues here who are more versed in interviewing skills and creation of stories. But this hat that you play to be able to interview members of the government and get evidence that their work is not happening as they say is happening, and highlighting it as a news story and having follow-up actions would assist in putting positive pressure to government to be able to change how things are operating, because this role and responsibility lies primarily with the member states and with the governments to be able to ensure that they are able to execute what they're tasked to do. And in this purpose is to be able to facilitate the movement of the people through issuance of travel documents that are valid. So I would encourage that, stories to be done around that, with interviews, of course, from all angles, the witness, the victims, the people who have applied for their passports and have not received it, the immigration officials and the ministries of interior who are tasked with the act of having to ensure that the citizens are able to move legally and appropriately with proper travel documents, etc. I'll hand it over back to you, Makungu, and other colleagues who may be able to complement that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeptum, for your comments. I'll just hand over straight to Vincent, who will also complement and add to the conversation. Over to you, Vincent.
Thanks, Makungu. The question by Silas actually reminds me of research we did probably about 15 years ago now, where one of the questions we asked people was about their preference in terms of migration and why, in the sample, there were a lot of irregular migrants who were interviewed. And we asked them why they were doing it. And that the answer that they gave is precisely what Silas is talking about. Most of them actually said, we'd prefer to have the necessary travel documents, we'd prefer to have the necessary permits and so on in order to go from one country to another. And they said it's just too difficult. It's expensive. Sometimes we have to travel long distances. And they say, we feel we have no choice but to migrate irregularly. And so it's a fundamental challenge, I think, for a lot of the countries in the SADC region, where the processing of passports, the processing of permits takes an incredibly long time. And of course, migrants cannot wait for that long. I think we have to recognize that this is one of the challenges in terms of the ratification and the implementation of the SADC protocol on the facilitation of movement. A number of countries have actually said, we cannot ratify this because we do not have the capacity to do what is required. And so what is required would be the speedy processing and issuing of documents, having in place proper infrastructure at ports of entry to facilitate movement and so on. And so if the media can report on this and the media can help explain why we have such a high incidence of irregular migration, and a lot of that does have to do with the difficulty in obtaining appropriate documentation and so on. But the media can also report, and I think more positively, on what governments have been talking about in order to facilitate movement and in order to make it easier for people to obtain documents. And so just think very broadly for a moment, the talks that we've had about an African Union passport, right? So the more states collaborate around having appropriate documentation, which doesn't matter where it is issued. So for example, you can have a travel permit issued in one SADC member state, and that travel permit is valid for all SADC member states. So that kind of collaboration between states, which they talk about in the facilitation of movement protocol, we see that in a lot of the regional and continental instruments where there's talk about that kind of collaboration. I think the media can play an important role in highlighting that this is actually what governments are talking about, this is what they want to achieve, and move away from this idea that it is the fault of the individual migrant that he or she is undocumented, but actually explaining these are some of the difficulties. And that would hopefully put some pressure, or at least encourage individual governments to strengthen their processes of issuing documents and so on. But we'll have to recognize that often it's a capacity problem, often it is a resource problem that governments are struggling with. And so we can encourage them to do better, and we can talk about the consequences of some of these challenges, in that it does result in irregular migration. And so my thing is, in response to Silas's question, is highlight what the challenges are and explain why in many cases we have such a high incidence of irregular migration. But also add on to that at least what governments are talking about at the moment. They're not really doing it, but they are talking about movement within the region being possible by having a travel permit issued in one country that is valid for all SADC member states.
Thank you so much, Vincent, for your inputs. And just to buttress to what Vincent and Jeptum have said, which was mentioned in Jeptum's presentation, that the role of the media is to highlight these issues, bring awareness, spread the knowledge that we have around these issues. In that way, we can prevent situations like this. We can make the government also aware and hold them accountable to some of the promises they make, and also make them take responsibilities in terms of maybe some of their contributions to the challenges that we are facing when we talk about issues of migration. I will also just keep encouraging people to either raise their hands or drop more questions. We still have a bit of time to tackle a number of questions and take the discussion further. I also see there's a question. Vincent, do you have your hand? Or is it an old hand?
No, I don't. I will remove it. That was from earlier.
Okay. There's Ashok, in going back to the issue that we were talking about around sensationalization, he actually made a very good point, and he says that we need not to be sensational to captivate attention. The reality is sufficiently captivating, and this is why I also referred to our sense of responsibility in order to put things in their perspectives and not isolate them to create sensation. And I fully agree. We have a sense of responsibility as a member of the media to give fair reporting and a balanced view. A question that was posed by VOA, how can ILO help Zimbabwe government in making citizens access documentation services without a hassle? I think Laura might be in the meeting, and maybe she can answer, give a better answer to that question, or a comment in response to VOA's question. Gloria, if you're available, you can just come through with the answer to that question. But I'll also just move to a comment that was dropped in the chat box now by Sandra. It says, as a communication officer for a humanitarian agency, very occasionally we wrote a press release about a case of human trafficking and the assistance provided by UN agencies in cooperation with governments, with governments for the individual to return home. The stories were carefully written to protect the identity of the affected person, including changing names, only providing general locations rather than specific community or of origin or destination, not including identifying details. The approval process for a story like this is sometimes challenging because of the protection concerns of the individual, concerns that the networks that transferred the person are still present and it could put the person at risk. And this is a very good comment, and it was raised even in Jeptum's presentation, the need to protect the names of the victims, their location, is very important, and that we must also keep at the back of our minds. But I like the point that they are raising around the challenge in terms of getting such stories approved. So I'd like to pose to our experts, what are some of the things that can actually assist our colleagues in communications, in our members of the media, in terms of trying to get the stories approved by their authorities or approved by their line managers and editors, since it's very, it's such a covered story. Sorry, someone is not muted. Sorry about that. Can we all mute our mics unless you have the floor to speak? Thank you. So yeah, I would just, as I was mentioning, that the point raised by Sandra is a very good point, and it's mainly the reality for a lot of our colleagues here who are either members of the media or work in communications around how do we then get such stories approved or get buy-in from firstly our line managers or our editors, because the stories are mainly covered. So we hide the identity, we hide the locations, we change a lot to protect the victim of the crime. But then how can we better convince our managers that the stories is worth running? Because she mentioned that there's usually a lot of challenges in the process to get the story approved. I'd like to call maybe Charles or Vincent, who might have experience in working with this to come and give us some inputs on this.
Thank you, Makungu. It's a bit like Ashok's comment earlier about captivating attention. I think we're really in the concrete, the very technical challenges. I don't necessarily have a simple answer to these tough questions, but a couple of comments I'd like to make. We should bear in mind the distortion between time to produce these stories and the current cycle of news production. And the two tend to collide. And that's part of where the challenge is. Rarely are journalists given, I would say, the necessary time to be able to produce, especially when we're talking of stories of individuals, what Vincent, I think, referred to as human interest stories. Do we see journalists have the necessary time and support from their organizations to actually do that properly, especially in the case of trafficking in person, when we're talking about transnational trafficking in person, which adds an extra layer of complexity because you have often to report on these stories across border. And so not only do you have time challenges and the pressure of the organization might conflict with the time that you would need to produce these stories adequately, but you also have financial pressure to, I think Jeptun or Abibo was saying earlier that these stories should include diversity of voices and sources of information. That is a very reasonable suggestion. Technically, at times, it might be a little bit more difficult to go back to the region of origin of the survivor, to actually be able to document what the context is like, to go where that person was actually exploited and understand what the context was like there. All of that, and I shared with you the story from Associated Press. When you look a little bit at how that story was produced, the number of people involved, the time it took, we are talking about, I think, over the course of 18 months. How often do you see in a newsroom 4 or 5 senior journalists get 18 months of time to be able to investigate such a story? So that would be my first comment. And I don't have an easy answer to that. There are, especially in the ILO toolkit on forced labor and fair recruitment, we identify some strategies. Looking for outside funding can be a way to resolve some of the financial challenges. Cooperation across borders, collaboration between newsrooms might be a way to overcome some of the technical challenges of reporting across border and might speed up some of the reporting. But it's true what Sandra is saying. If you want to do it carefully, you need to take time, and often that collides with the interest, and I would say at times the basic knowledge of editors who don't necessarily see why so much time must be invested on these issues. But then, I mean, I want to make a second comment, which is I found very interesting that VOA and Carla's comment were not necessarily specifically on trafficking, but were on other aspects of managing migration, such as, processing documentation or access to documentation services. That, from the onset, doesn't sound like a trafficking story. It's not the typical trafficking story you're used to read. It doesn't have a victim or a survivor involved, but it's very well connected to trafficking issues because it's often at the root of the problem, the fact that legal pathways for migration, even though they are maybe presented at the political level, aren't operational on the ground, which creates space for abuse, deception. And at times I'd like to move away from also the idea that, you know, you on one side you have the smuggling of migrants where you have people who are willingly going, and also the trafficking who is completely unwillingly exploited. It's often much more complex, and it's often as well the shortcomings in terms of policy. The fact that you've tried your way of migrating regularly, you've tried your way 2 or 3 times at getting a job properly, and that doesn't work out correctly, and so you're going to find yourself kind of coerced voluntarily and involuntarily into accepting something, not necessarily exactly knowing what is the promise that is given to you. And that's how you fall into maybe a situation of trafficking. And reporting that goes all the way to the top, looking at very simple questions of access to documentation or access to employment, actually can be connected to trafficking. Now, that only happens if the journalist from the beginning goes into these issues knowing that he wants to connect that to trafficking. And that's where some of you can really make a difference, I think, in your reporting. If you say, okay, I want to get people in Zimbabwe interested about trafficking, I don't have the time and resources to properly document one individual case, but I'm going to try and go back to the root factors and ask some questions to the general public. And those are stories that we are not seeing, especially because of a lack of time and a lack of understanding. And the tweet that I showed you earlier, when you look at a boat and you say, okay, let's put half of the boat in that category and half of the boat in that other category, is lack of time. You can't say that just the next day. You've not taken time to individually process and look at these 686 persons. And it's a lack of understanding of the diversity of experience that we can have. So move away from patterns, pre-established patterns, and try to have a better understanding of the complexity.
Oh, thank you so much, Charles, for that perspective. And I think the project in itself, the SAMM project, I think is a good example of how we're trying to get us to start thinking of migration in a joint manner, that it's all not separate, that in us reporting on issues of trafficking or labor migration or stateless persons, all of those things are interconnected. And I think that's the value of having a project like this, where by nature we have 4 agencies working together. So I think even now, as a member of the media and our participants, I think Charles is posing a very important thought for us to start thinking about not just our preconceived ideas that, okay, this is just a labor migration story, or this is just a trafficking story, but to start looking deep in those nuances. And in that way, we tell the full story of migration and not leaving one aspect out of it. And in that way, we get to kill so many birds with literally one story and one stone. I'll also just like Abiba to come in as a regional communications officer to just give maybe some of his inputs or take on the comment made by Sandra from a communications perspective in terms of some of the challenges she has experienced or she's highlighting when trying to write stories or piece stories around issues of migration. Over to you, Abiba.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Makungu. No, this is what Sandra said is very much apropos. As a matter of fact, Sandra is my colleague in Mozambique. She's our IOM communication officer there. So unfortunately, my echo, I would actually echo this situation that me and her have discussed multiple times, actually, in the line of our work, which is knowing how to create the balance. I mean, writing a press note, a press note, a press release, however it is that we all call it, are for the public, and it really challenges the art of writing, which is basically the daily challenge for any media practitioner. How to bring a story that will be as thorough as possible in terms of its content, but also a story that includes as many voices as possible, but not in a way to rattle any cages negatively, but rather to as we say, to generate some kind of a discussion, or at least we're going to call it polite pressure in the right directions. So even in the interactions and the inclusion of the voices, or in the way of displaying the voices of local, national, or regional authorities, it is also very important that the writing style does not come across as finger pointing. This is also something to be very, very, very careful about. So as much as all voices have to be approached and engaged with and debated with, quote unquote, it is very important to understand that it's not by a language style of alienation that language for the public would lend properly. And of course, in the very same token, because we're discussing a multiplicity of voices within public communication, emphasizing the comfort of either the survivors, or let's call them the beneficiaries, in this case, the migrants, is something that cannot be emphasized enough to have to be done with a lot of subtlety, with in mind the understanding that their privacy has to be protected where it applies, where it is their wish. Within IOM, of course, we have every time we deal with beneficiaries, for the sake of any public output, we have a very stiff consent mechanism to ensure that however it is that we utilize their likeness is fully agreed upon by them, in which case we have various other ways to still tell the story without exposing the beneficiaries. But this is something that, of course, journalists, we're doing it because we're coming from the angle of communication from the standpoint of international organizations and agencies. But when it comes to journalists, they have other sets of realities to deal with beyond our own, which are fully understood as well. But perhaps, of course, a voice to include, as we were mentioning, all these voices approaching relevant departments within governments and stakeholders, also including the voices of these agencies and international entities who are providing support to governments, just as IOM, ILO, and others are providing support to governments in the regions vis-a-vis our respective mandates. So those are voices that are also useful because they are also source of information for you, media practitioners, again, which is the reason why we are beginning this relationship and this media training. So those are interconnected entities that work extremely, very much so hand in hand. So the pressure really is on media practitioners to find a way to create that balance where, and actually when we talk about how to generate attention from the public or other stakeholders and audiences, the more thorough, the more detailed a story is, an article is, the more attention it is likely to also get. And the more you can also perhaps pitch it to your respective editors, because we also know that you have an additional layer of a process to go through when it comes to stories that you want to cover. Your editors also have a strong say-so on whether or not it is of interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abibo, for those comments and inputs. I don't see any other question or comment in the chat. If you do have your final thoughts, final questions, I see a hand raised by Vincent. Vincent, you can have the floor.
Thanks very much, Makungu. And this will be, I think, my final comment for the day, unless there are specific questions where I think can be helpful. But I just wanted to go back to the issue raised by Jeptum in her presentation, where she talked about the difference between smuggling and trafficking, where smuggling is a crime against the state. And that basically means that the person is committing an offense in terms of immigration law, whereas trafficking is a crime against an individual. And so it falls into, even if it's not trafficking, it falls into the same category as kidnapping, as violence against the person, and so on. And I think it's important in the reporting to make that distinction, because it often, not just the legal distinction between trafficking and smuggling gets blurred, but often the way in which we report on that. So I think part of the reporting has to be, when it's a case of smuggling, the person has committed an offense in terms of the immigration law. When it is a case of trafficking, it in fact falls into the broader, much more clear-cut category of a criminal offense. Which leads me to my second point, which is that a lot of countries in the SADC region do not have specific anti-trafficking legislation. And this is what UNODC, IOM, and others are working on, which is to get countries to have the legislation. But how do you deal with trafficking as a crime in and of itself? So that when you arrest perpetrators of trafficking, that you don't just charge them with kidnapping or abduction or some other offense for which you have legislation, but that the act of trafficking itself is actually criminalized. And again, here, I think the media can play an important role in, I use the word advocating, but in creating awareness around the need for specific anti-trafficking legislation where the offenses are very clearly defined. So even if it is just a case of coercion, which often then escapes kidnapping or abduction, and it's very difficult to prosecute, if you have that defined in law, trafficking, and if you have the appropriate mechanisms and the appropriate institutions, so specialized prosecutors, for example, specialized courts to deal with trafficking, all of those become important. And I think the media can play an important role in helping to create an environment where trafficking in and of itself is taken very seriously, not just in terms of policy and legislation, but also in terms of creating the necessary institutions to deal with it as a crime that is different from smuggling, or that is different from murder, and so on. So in other words, I'm saying the media can help us draw specialized attention to trafficking, and in that way encourage governments to actually make sure that they have the appropriate policies, laws, and institutions in place.
Thank you so much, Vincent, for those inputs. I think they're very, very, very helpful, and I'm sure our participants are gaining so much information and insight from all the comments and all the presentations made today. I will just now, as we wrap up our session for this morning, if you still have any other question, you can drop your comments in the chat box, your final comments, or you can raise your hand. While we wait for that, I would just ask Jeptum, Charles, and Abibo to give their final words or final messages or remarks before we wrap up before we wrap up the session. And we'll come back to Ashok's comments. I think it's just some logistics clarifications that we can clarify at the end of the session. So Charles, Abibo, and Jeptum, you can come through with your final remarks. I can give Charles the floor. Yes.
Thank you, Makungu. I'll be quite brief. I think you know what was said earlier. The fact, just this project in essence is really, I think, what we should have in mind in terms of how we should look at these issues. It's very positive that different agencies, and Jeptum reminded us that agencies have specific mandates. and they've been used to communicate on their specific mandates as well, at times increasing the ideas that these mandates might be separate in some ways, or might function alongside one another. And that's not exactly how it works with migration flows. Migration flows are not people walking side by side under the umbrella of different organizations. It's mixed, it's much more diverse, and that's where journalists have a key role to play in trying to make sure that we have more understanding. And it's also something that these migration flows, something that happens with a very strong relationship with people who are not migrating. And I think that was one of Vincent's comment last week, of not isolating migration issues from the rest of the population. So we are seeing every day with each new presentation, we are adding a layer of complexity. That layer of complexity is just, I think, what makes the reality of the modern world so interesting. But I'd really like you to reflect on how you, as a journalist or a communicator, or how your organization is communicating, and are you going towards a simplification or an oversimplification of this complexity? And in that sense, that can be very harmful, because as you simplify individual or collective experiences, you are not helping in identifying the needs of each and every one, the rights, and how they should be treated. And at the same time, how do we make sure that we are not complexifying for our audience the reality, making it too complex for the audience to understand? And in my opinion, I think I shared the quote from John Simpson, which is in the ILO toolkit. This is where most of you have the main challenge ahead of you. Abiba was talking about writing and writing skills. That's at the end what most probably makes the difference. The capacity of some to be able to take some complex issues and to present them in a way that is accessible for the audience and the general public. And I very much liked some of the comments we had today in the chat box, looking at some precise issues. We talked last week about campaigns, doing series of reports. I hope you're coming to understand that the complexity of mixed migration in the SADC region is not something you can portray in one single piece. It's more a collective effort, either individually by producing different stories that look at different aspects of the issue, or also a collective effort nationally or regionally that can help us add these different layers of complexity and bring the general public to understand and ideally support efforts that go in favor of better regulation, better policies related to migration, and also in terms of trafficking, what Vincent was suggesting, better, or just to start crafting real national anti-trafficking policies. So I hope we're not getting you lost in confusion and translation, but I think we're on the right track if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed by the number of issues that are at stake.
Thank you so much, Charles. I really also hope you're not being so overwhelmed by the many layers, but as Charles mentioned, that migration is very complex and it's very layered, and all of this work together. And I think this is where our coaches will be present in the next 2 weeks when you are writing the stories, to guide you and to assist you, that in case you're feeling a bit overwhelmed. Am I writing a trafficking story? Am I writing a labor migration story? They will be there to actually help you and guide you throughout the process of actually producing your stories and your articles in a way that is very balanced and very creative, and we look forward to seeing those. Now I'll just turn over to Jeptum to give their final comments, and Abibo, and then we can wrap up our session for today.
Thank you very much, Makungu and colleagues. I don't think I can add anything further to what has been said here today. It really has been a very good session. We just avail ourselves to you, members of the media. If you have any question, any query, if you want to cover a story on trafficking persons, smuggling of migrants, please feel free to reach to us. We're happy to support you technically in terms of the content, and also in terms of communication through our interface, Makungu. So I wish you all a very good day, rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Jeptum, our colleague from UNODC. As she rightfully mentions, to be always available for any questions related to the topics you discussed today. Feel free to reach out, and we'll be happy to assist our now partners, who is now the media. And I'll just give Abibo to give his final comments, and we can wrap up the session.
Thank you very much, Makungu. I think after Charles and Jeptum, clearly there wouldn't be a single thing that I need to add, but just re-emphasizing that with the beginning of this relationship with our new partners, this was a discussion to make everyone understand that migration is extremely complex, but it's also extremely relevant as a topic of discussion. It is extremely relevant regionally, but nationally, regionally, but also globally. And as our media practitioner colleagues understand on a day-to-day basis, the art of journalism and the duty of journalism is pretty much married and has a very strong relationship with the concept of relevance. So this is also an entry point when we want to discuss how to make such topics headlines. And number two, again, to reiterate that this proves that migration is such a cross-cutting matter. I mean, the fact that all these international agencies have come together under the SAMM umbrella in order to tackle the issue of migration management and how to better package it for the public by way of having a better relationship with media practitioners shows not only the complexity of the matter, but its relevance, and also the need for all dots to be connected, for us to be closer to each other when it comes to interactions, so that not only your public pieces will be much more enriched, but also, as we know, if I can go further and say, in most developed countries, I think it's very much understood that media is either the third or the fourth, let's say, national, I'm going to use the term weapon, but let's say tool, even after, you know, army and so on and so forth. So your existence and your relevance cannot be measured as media practitioners. So these interconnectivities with us as source of information for you can also not be measured. And I really hope that this is the beginning of a strong partnership between our side as a coalition of international agencies who day-to-day work to support the governments within which you respectively operate, and of course for the sake of the many migrants and beneficiaries that we aim to support and assist. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abibo. And I don't have anything else to add, and I see there's no more questions in the chat box. I'll just like to thank all our participants today, and a big thank you to Jeptum and Abibo for the presentation, and our resident, I'll call them our resident experts, Charles and Vincent. Thank you very, very much for working this journey with us in the media training. I'm sure you have enjoyed it as much as we have enjoyed having you, and to our participants, our special guests, the members of the media. Thank you so much for availing yourself every day for this 2 hours in the morning to have such insightful discussions. We look forward to those stories and pieces that are going to come out of this training that will be published in the region. It's not just our country, we're based in South Africa, but we are aiming to cover the region, the SADC region, as the project operates or spends in the IOC and the SADC region. So for me, thank you so much. I don't have anything else to add. I'll just hand over to Fernando to give us any announcements we might have. But just that tomorrow we are having another session. Sorry, Ashok, for I think it might have been a typo in the document. It is the same time slots like we've been having, 8:30 to 10:30 in the morning. And it will be our final webinar tomorrow. We will be having UNHCR, the High Commissioner of Refugees will be present to give a presentation around persons of concerns, which includes internally displaced persons, stateless persons, refugees, and asylum seekers. So tomorrow also we're adding on another layer to the layers we've been adding on. We're now gonna have a focus on asylum seekers, refugees, stateless persons, and internally displaced persons. And we'll have the UNHCR, who is also a partner in the project, to give their presentation. So looking forward to having you all and having a fruitful discussion tomorrow. Thank you so much. Over to you, Fernando.
Thank you very much, Makungo. I think you gave participants all the most relevant information already. I just would like to say that my impression is that today we had a very rich session, and that as we're getting to the close of the second phase, to the end of the second phase, tomorrow we're going to have our last webinar. I see that all the points that we saw in the previous sessions, the theoretical perspectives and all that, we're bringing them to our conversation. So I see that it's really getting more interesting and richer as we get to this final part where I have the chance to discuss. So I think the participants also share this impression. I see that things are going very well. And as Makungu mentioned, tomorrow we're going to have our session at 8:30. So don't worry, we're not going to be here until 11:30 p.m. So it's going to be probably we're going to be a little bit longer just to give you some information about the assignment, the exercise we're going to do in the next 2 weeks. So, but it's going to be a very similar session to today's one. And so with that, I just would like to thank our speakers, our experts, our facilitators, our interpreters, and wish you a very nice day, and see you tomorrow at 8:30 for our last webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.